Hi everybody, Gray here. I want to talk to you a little bit today about how to arrange songs for solo fingerstyle guitar. Before we get into that, I want to give you a couple general ideas of where to start and where to go with this. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between making an arrangement from the perspective of being an arranger and making an arrangement from the perspective of being a player. I think that's a really interesting distinction. So I can basically look at a fingerstyle arrangement and kind of guess, was this written from more of an arranger perspective or more of a player perspective? And the main giveaway is usually that if it's written from a player's perspective, it can look really complicated on paper, even if it's actually not that complicated to play physically. And vice versa. If it's written from an arranger's perspective, it might actually look really clean and logical on paper, but then be harder to play. So actually, I'm not really advocating that you use only one of these perspectives, but I do think it's really interesting. Basically, if you sit down with a pen and paper and write something out, you might then go to your instrument and find out that, what seemed reasonable on paper didn't work out quite the way I expected, and then vice versa. If you work out something on your instrument, you might find, this is actually really hard to figure out how I would tab this out. And the better you get at thinking from both of those perspectives, I think the better your arrangements will be. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about what I consider to be a good arrangement, and I would boil it down to this. A good arrangement is absolutely no harder than it must be. And in many cases, that means a good arrangement is relatively easy to play, not necessarily, but generally, yeah. If I can sit down, pick up an arrangement, and it's easy to play, and I learn it really quickly, and it sounds good, to me, that's the golden grail of arranging. So try to kind of, some of us have this habit of expecting so much of ourselves. If I can't play, it's because I'm no good. I need to practice more. Yeah, obviously we need to practice more, but when you're judging your arrangements, you're actually going to judge them from the opposite perspective as when you're judging your playing. When you're judging your playing, it's did I live up to did I play it? Did I live up to it? Did I do it? But when you're judging your arrangements, kind of the opposite. It's like, did I make something so easy that anybody could learn it and play it and make it sound really good? So these are actually kind of opposing forces. So this perspective has also not only helped me with my arranging, but also with my playing in general. When I'm transcribing something or when I'm just figuring out how to play something, I start to think about, I should probably figure out a way that's really reasonable and comfortable to do this, because that's ultimately going to make my playing sound better if I'm figuring out ergonomic and smart ways to play things, rather than just always, expecting myself to be better and better and practice more and more to play on reasonably hard things. And let's talk about the kind of melodies that are good to start your arrangement with. I wouldn't recommend something like Pirates of the Caribbean for your first arrangement, for example. A lot of rhythm, repetition, fast speed, and a melody that, it's maybe catchy, but it's not really, doesn't feel very singable. A better melody would be something like Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Somewhere over the rainbow way. The kind of melody that you feel like you just keep singing along to and get stuck in your head. Although Somewhere Over the Rainbow probably wouldn't be your best melody for your first arrangement, because there's a lot of leaps and those can be a little bit tricky to deal with. But overall, that's the kind of tune we're going for. Today I picked one called Red River Valley, really well-known song from late 1800s America or Canada or something like that. I picked it because it's public domain, I'm not going to lie, but it's a really nice song. It's in every guitar method book that there is. So let's hear the melody. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out what kind of chords do we want to use to harmonize with this melody. And in order to do that, we've got to try to figure out, we've got to get at what is the harmonic rhythm. In other words, how often does the chord change? Do we have a chord every measure, a chord every 2 measures? Generally speaking, in common time, which is 4/4, you're going to have a chord every 2 measures or 1 measure, or sometimes just every 2 beats, which is when you split a measure in half. So it's a very 2-to-1 relationship. 2 beats, or 4 beats, or 8 beats, something like that. And you're going to see in a minute how to figure that out. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at each measure and look at the contents and try to guess which of these melody notes belong to the chord and which of them don't. So generally, if there's a leap, both the starting point of the leap and the end point, both notes are typically part of the chord's harmony, and that was a principle that classical composers discovered hundreds of years ago, and it's surprisingly true in today's music. It's very rare that you would leap to or from a non-chord tone. So that's one clue. If you've got leaps, both points are probably in the chord. Another clue is about the strong and the weak beats. So, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all strong beats. So any notes that appear on 1, 2, 3, and 4 are likely, but not necessarily, to be chord tones. Notes that are very long, like a quarter note or longer, are also likely to be chord tones. And notes that are very loud are also likely to be chord tones. These are all things that would point to a note being a chord tone. And so those are the factors that make a chord likely to be a chord tone, but then there are also factors that can diminish a note's importance and make it less likely to be a chord tone. So if it's very short or if it's very quiet, that might help kind of, lower its prominence. But another very, very common thing is, and the big exception to all the things I just described, is that if a note is a step in between two chord tones, you've got like mi, re, do. Now that re is kind of like the meat in a sandwich made from mi and do. And so because it approaches and resolves that by step, that can just as well be not a chord tone at all, even if it shows up on a strong beat, which you'll see it does here. So we've got mi, re, do, re, do. This re is on the 4, which is actually kind of a strong beat, but right before that is a do, and right after that is a mi. So from that, I can kind of infer that this re is not a chord tone, but that this chord is going to have mi and do. Now because it has mi and do, or E and C, I can just look at, well, note that I have a capo on here, so it's actually not E and C, but I'm going to keep calling it E and C because way easier that way. Because it's mi and do, or E and C, I can just look at my chart of chords that show up in the key of C, and I can just assign a chord to live here that happens to contain both of those ingredients. And that's really cool. Now I'm going to tell you another trick. There are really only 3 chords you to start with, 1, 4, and 5. And that's because there's 3 types of chord. There's a dominant, a subdominant, and a tonic. Those are the 3 types of chord. And whenever you have a tonic chord, you can just use 1. Whenever you have a subdominant chord, you can use 4. Whenever you have a dominant chord, you can use 5. So what you can do is you can first give every measure or half measure or whatever it is the assignment of 1, 4, or 5, and after that you can swap out. For example, if you used 1 too many times, the C chord, you can swap that out. You can say, I don't want to use the C chord here, I'm going to switch that to A minor. And that's exactly what I did in my selection. I went C chord straight to A minor chord because those are both the same type of chord. I could have also just used C for the whole measure, but I wanted a little bit more harmonic motion. So let me walk you through the logic of why I picked some of these chords. And I did choose a couple chords that were a little bit fancy. So in your first arrangement, I just want to hear 1, 4, and 5. But maybe you can also kind of benefit from some of my thinking as well. So we've got 1 and 6. Second measure is just la, do. That fits perfectly with an F chord. And I didn't change the chord on that measure. I just kept that F chord for the whole measure. And then for measure 3, mi, so. I went to E minor here. Now I could have just stayed on C. So, but again, I like to have a little bit of motion. Now, it wasn't as easy to go to A minor because the G is actually not in the A minor, although it could be if you had a minor 7. And also, I used C to A minor in measure 1, so I thought, hey, why not just switch it to an E minor? Give me some more, some more motion, something that's more interesting to listen to. And then in the last measure of the line, it's pretty clear to me that you're going to have a 5 chord because we're resting on re. And it's very typical that we rest on a melody note like re or ti or sol at the end of a line, and that's it's kind of a partial cadence where we're resting on the 5 chord instead of resting on the 1 chord. And sure enough, next measure we go back to the 1 chord. So some of this is just how chords tend to behave. 5 tends to go to 1, and in a set of 4 chords, the first one will often be the 1 chord, and the last one will often be the 5 chord. That's just a very common pattern. So here, in the second line, I did actually kind of the same thing, but in order to spice things up a little bit, I went to A major instead of A minor, which meant that I had to actually take the melody note itself and raise it up a half step. And then you'll see why I did that in a second, because there's a D minor after that. Now, if you think about D itself, if there was a key of D minor, which there is a key of D minor, and you go up to the 5th chord of D minor, D, E, F, G, A, that 5th chord of the D minor key would be in A major or A dominant 7th. Now, we're not in the key of D minor, but even being in the key of C major, we can actually borrow that chord from the key of D minor and stick it right in front of the D. That's called a secondary dominant. It's very, very common. It's in the national anthem. It's in a lot of songs. Very common motion, very cool thing to do. And it gives you access to new notes and even accidentals, new notes that are outside of the key and new chords. It's a really cool thing to do. After that D minor, I and went to D minor 7 flat 5. Now D minor 7 flat 5 is not from any key of C, it's actually from the key of C minor. And that's also very common when you're in a major key, like C major. You can actually sometimes just mix in chords that come from the parallel minor, from C minor. So that's what I did here. Now when you do that, it's also very common to use the most similar chord before that. And what that does, it makes the listener kind of feel comfortable. Oh, of course D minor is going to be in this key, but then when you go to the D minor 7 flat 5, even though it's kind of a weird chord, it's a weird chord, but actually only one note had to change. So you kind of gently guide the listener through that experience rather than just spraying them with cold water and kind of shocking them. And then we just go to G and we go to C. So again, that uses a little bit of advanced harmony knowledge, secondary dominance, and modal interchange and things like that. If you're not sure about those things, don't worry, there's plenty of time to learn. In the meantime, if this is your first arrangement, just use 1, 4, and 5 for now. And then maybe you can kind of sneak in some 6s and some 2s in there, and that would already be really good. Okay, so now we've done the most important thing, which is fixed the melody down, including its rhythm, that's very important, on paper, that's very important, and assigned chords to each part of the melody, also very important. That's like kind of the basic ingredients you need to have an arrangement. That's what I want to get before I even start. You can save yourself some trouble by using a popular song where the chords are already out there somewhere. You can just directly use the original chords. That's a great way to do it. I like to rewrite the chords because I think it's more fun that way. But you don't even necessarily have to do that step. If you want to try this yourself, you can do it using the melody that I'm going to provide in the lesson materials. So don't forget to download the lesson materials. It's pretty important. But the reason we want to write this all on paper is because as we're exploring and playing with this, it's going to evolve over time. And if we don't have stuff on paper, we're not going to really be able to make continuous refinements to it. It's going to be kind of hard to remember all the different decisions we made. So you want to have this on paper and slowly refine it, as opposed to just playing it over and over on your instrument, because that tends to put you in a different mindset when you're playing on the instrument, doesn't it? So something to keep in mind. So now we're actually ready to start fleshing out our arrangement in terms of how it's played. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put a bass note to go with each melody according to how the chords change. That's the first thing. And notice that at this point, I'm already thinking about the overall chord voicing. So the first chord, for example, is C. There's a lot of ways to play a C. Now, note that I do need to have me and E in the melody, but because it's an open string, I can do that in a lot of ways. And the thing I'm emphasizing here is that because there's a lot of ways to play each chord, you want to know as many as you can, ideally, because it's going to give you the most possible choices. And what I'm trying to do here is make sure that at this stage, I'm keeping in mind what the chord voicing is going to be that I'm going to be playing off of. And I want the melody, which is predetermined, to be kind of on the highest string I can get it usually. And then I want the bass to be kind of on the lowest string that I can get it usually, because I generally want my chords to have at least 4 strings apart between the lowest and the highest note. The reason being that gives me more options to play notes in between. Now that's not a hard and fast rule, it's an easy way to go wrong when you're arranging if your melody and your bass are right together and you just feel like you don't have much to do. Now, an advanced arranging technique that you might encounter later is the melody can actually kind of go on down to the bass and all kinds of cool things. So this is not actually a rule. It's more of a guideline I'm putting out there for you to get started with. So then you can think about what are the chord voicings that allow me to play the root and the bass of each chord, as well as the notes of the melody. And so you can explore some chord voicings. And notice that the more chord voicings you know, the better your arrangement's going to be because the more options you have. So if you want to arrange for fingerstyle guitar, you really want to learn as much as you can about the chords on the neck. All right, so now that we've done that, I'm going to do something a little bit controversial, which is I'm going to fill in every single eighth note with a note from the prevailing chord. Now, I said it's controversial because, it's a little bit simplistic, I think, if you're doing an arrangement and you just kind of use a broad brush and put a note on every eighth note, but I think it being simplistic makes it a very good way for us to get started. So what we're going to do now is we're going to split everything that doesn't have an eighth note so that it's all 100% eighth notes, and every eighth note that is not part of the melody or bass is just going to be a filler from the chord we chose in the last step. So it's going to sound like this. Notice that this doesn't necessarily have to be bad for the rhythm, because you can still get a sort of emphasis on certain rhythms like you can still emphasize certain beats by accenting them and stuff, so it doesn't necessarily have to define the rhythmic feel of the tune. But I think it's going to be really make it easier for you to play, because then when you're playing, you kind of know, okay, I just have to sort of like rigidly and, you know, with a stable time feel, kind of play each of the things I'm looking at from left to right. And that, I think, will make it easier for you to play and hear your own arrangements as you're getting started. Later on, of course, you definitely don't need to have notes on every beat. That's not really the way that you need to do it all the time, but I think you'll find it's a really reliable way to get started. And now that we've done that, I'm going to show you a couple little tweaks that I decided to make. And this is where I really just start to use pure subjectivity, just going by my ear and just, I don't like this, how this plays, how this feels, how this looks, how this sounds, that kind of thing. So the first one is in measure 3. I really didn't like how that ended up with an E minor, and then all the notes ended up on the first string. It just, you know, the guitar is a polyphonic instrument, and when you play one string repeatedly, it starts to turn into a monophonic instrument. But I'll tell you something, the acoustic guitar is not a very good monophonic instrument. Well, I guess when you play fast it is, but if you're trying to get some really long sustain out of notes, that's where the acoustic guitar doesn't really shine. So what we like to do there, and what I like to do, is switch that up so that the melody is spread across more strings. So what I did to do that, I moved up to this E minor here up the neck. Now, if I was arranging this for a very, very beginning student, I probably wouldn't ask them to do that. I would just use the original version. But I thought for my own playing, that's a kind of reasonable transition to make, and I can do that, so let me do that. And that's a key point about arranging. You're going to try to make the arrangement the appropriate difficulty level for the player, whether that be you or somebody else. But you can hear when I play the melody here, the notes kind of blend together, mesh together, sustain longer, and I just think it sounds prettier that way. The second change I made is in the very following measure, measure 4. The melody kind of drops out there, and we're just kind of plucking around the chord. That's a little bit boring. We have this concept in arrangement called focus. When the ear is letting go of something, in this case the melody, maybe that's a good time for the ear to grab on to something else. So we're at measure 4, there's nothing going on in any of the other layers. So what we can do is we can make that bass a little bit more interesting. Now all I did there was just alternate between two bass notes, but that I think brings the ear's attention more to some other aspect of the arrangement, which is what I was going for. Later on I'll show you a couple of alternatives to that we came up with. Finally, I didn't really like what happened in measure 6. Now because I had a D minor 7 flat 5, the melody had to go from A to A flat. That's fine. But what I didn't like about it was it felt a little bit weak. A very common thing to do in this case, where you have like a D minor to D minor 7 flat 5, when you're using the same root, but the chord itself is changing, is you repeat as much of the content as you can. And what that does is it kind of reinforces to the ear, hey, here's the justification for why this crazy chord is here. It's just like, don't be afraid. It's just like, this next chord is just like that last one. That's a very beautiful thing to my ear. We have this one motion on one this is a diatonic chord, belongs in the key. And we kind of try to persuade the ear to accept the next chord by using the exact same everything, changing the minimal amount, which in this case is just one note, that A goes to A flat. And you hear that very often, by the way, when this chord shows up. Like that. So that's just something I did to satisfy my own ear. Okay, so in the following step, I introduced some hammer-ons, and I also fleshed out the chords on beats 1 and 3. Instead of just playing two notes, I went ahead and played the whole chord as much as I could. Notice that there's only ever 4 notes happening at once. That's kind of important because there's really only 4 fingers that are playing fingerstyle. Of course, you could strum, and that would be the exception to that. But just to keep it simple, I do 4 notes happening at once. And also notice that it's typical that the notes played by the index, middle, and ring are all adjacent strings. They don't usually like to be separated. So those are things I keep in mind when I'm doing this kind of thing. In measure 2, I actually swapped the melody note with the filler note so that now the melody note is actually in the wrong place. So don't think to yourself that you're not allowed to change the melody note, that it's something sacred. I think if you can make a better arrangement, why not? Just change it around. And that's about it, just to flesh in the chords and add some hammer-ons. In the next step, I started to add some rhythmic interest. Now, keep in mind, I could have done this very early on in the arrangement, but because I'm trying to show you step by step how you can start from the most simple ideas and evolve, I chose to save it for later. But you know, if your sense of rhythm, particularly writing and notating rhythm, is pretty well developed, there's no reason why you wouldn't just start doing this in the very beginning. So what I did was I separated some notes into sixteenths. And I really just kind of followed my own ear. So just some rhythms that started popping in my head. I kind of, that sounds nice. Let me hear that, and let me try that out. And then I would try to figure out how to write it out. And once I had written a couple out, I just sort of, you know, like in measure 5, I didn't necessarily do that anymore. I just sort of copied the rhythms that I had used and expanded upon them a bit. That's a little bit of what I'm talking about, that kind of interplay between me as the player, kind of trying stuff and figuring it out with my fingers, and me as the arranger, kind of looking rationally at the stuff I did and just sort of copying and pasting it or just tweaking it a little bit. You'll notice here I also decided to change measure 4 again. I just something I heard, some cool idea I heard happening where these notes keep climbing. Now in the last iteration, I just added a slap on beats 2 and 4. Now notice that, provided that there's no melody note happening, that's actually really easy to do. And so actually, if you wanted to make that really easy for yourself, you could offset the melody notes whenever they show up on beats 2 and 4, offset them by an eighth note so that they don't show up on that beat. And that way, you can just directly slap this without having to also play a note at the same time. That's a very different technique. So this is a pretty easy technique, but playing notes and slapping is a pretty hard technique. So that definitely takes some practice. And here we get into this idea that, you know, let the techniques you use suit the player, which may be you, and also suit the song. So in this particular song, so many notes were happening on 2 and 4 that, you know, I'd have to make some pretty big changes to the song if I was going to try to just do a simple slap. So I needed the more complex slap in order to get my rhythm going into there. But in many other songs where, you know, only once in a while does that happen, what you can do is just omit on that beat. You just omit it. And then, so this is what I was getting at too with the two perspectives. The arranger wants to draw. You got a pencil in your head. You want to draw an X on 2 and 4 and 2 and 4 and 2 and 4. You know, you're painting with a brush. But the player is the one who has to play it and maybe go, oh, you know, it's kind of unreasonable to try to slap here. So you want to join those two mindsets together. And what happens is, if you omit that slap sometimes, but not other times, it's really not going to make a big difference. If you play the arrangement with a consistent rhythm, what happens is the ear actually starts to carry that beat with it. And even when you stop playing that slap technique, the ear is going to kind of hear it going on like an illusion in the background. So I think it's a really neat concept. Alright everybody, thanks so much for checking out this lesson. Don't forget to download the notation below. And what I would really encourage you to do is just take one simple example, 8 measures, song you know, and try to arrange it for fingerstyle guitar. See how far you can get, add a little bit of bass, add a little bit of chords. If you're able to do that, I really hope you'll upload it and share it with me because I'm really looking forward to hearing what you come up with. Thanks so much everyone, and we'll see you next time.